They looked her up and down and laughed in her face. "We don't sell to people like you," they said with contempt. Humiliated, rejected, invisible. But what no one imagined was that, just minutes later, Rihanna would walk into the store, and everything would change in an instant. When they saw her, the employees froze. Her words hit like a slap in the face. And what she did next left everyone in shock. This is what happened. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching us from. Grace Miller sat on the edge of her bed with her phone in hand. Her fingers moved cautiously across the screen as she opened the banking app. Her heart pounded, as if sensing that what she was about to see would define more than just an expense. It would define her courage. The balance appeared in cold, exact numbers. She made a quick mental calculation, subtracting the pending bills and the unavoidable expenses of the week. Her stomach tightened. Technically, she could afford the bracelet. It wasn't an impulsive purchase. She had been saving diligently for months. But still, a pang of doubt ran through her. Should she spend what had taken her so much effort to save, or should she keep the money for something more important? Her fingers drummed on the screen, undecided. One click, and the money would be set aside. One click, and there would be no turning back. She took a deep breath. It wasn't just about the bracelet. It was about what it represented. Something of her own, a symbol that, for once, she could indulge herself without feeling guilty. She exhaled and closed the app, pushing herself out of indecision. She would do it. She would do it today. With that newly acquired determination, she stood up and opened her closet. Her clothes were modest, functional, carefully chosen pieces meant to last. She scanned the hangers, looking for something that would give her the confidence she so badly needed. She finally settled on dark-fitted jeans that, though simple, flattered her figure effortlessly, a classic blouse with good style, and elegant leather boots that looked new because she only wore them on special occasions. She smoothed the fabric with her hands and looked at herself in the mirror. She looked good. Not spectacular, not striking, but good. Even so, something about her reflection made her feel insecure. Her clothes didn't scream luxury, didn't speak of money or exclusivity. And that was precisely the kind of place she was going to. She ran a hand through her hair, trying to style it in a way that looked more polished. She put on a pair of small earrings and a bit of lip gloss. That was the best she could do. Even with all her effort, the insecurity remained. But she refused to let those doubts paralyze her. She grabbed her purse and walked out of her apartment, closing the door with fragile but firm determination. The bus ride to the Grove was a mix of excitement and nerves, feeling as if she attracted admiring glances, which reassured her and eased some of her initial doubts. The shopping center was a world of its own, with its elegant architecture and air of exclusivity. Every time she went, she felt like she was stepping into a place that didn't entirely belong to her. But today was different. Today, she had a purpose. When she got off the bus, the fresh Los Angeles air hit her face. She adjusted her purse on her shoulder and walked forward. The people around her carried designer bags and moved with the confidence of those who belonged there. A well-dressed man walking out of the Grove stared at her, dazed, and Grace felt her self-esteem rise. As she continued across the esplanade, a woman with a designer handbag looked her up and down and let out an almost inaudible laugh. Doubts flooded Grace's mind, and her heart skipped a beat. Had that been a direct judgment? An instant rejection just because of her appearance? She decided not to dwell on it, but the insecurity seeped into her chest like a weight. Her steps carried her directly to the luxury store section, where the shop windows gleamed as if they were entrances to another world. Grace walked slowly through the main hallway of the mall, carefully observing the illuminated storefronts. Her heart pounded as she passed by displays filled with luxurious dresses, elegant shoes, and designer handbags. Several stores caught her interest, but upon seeing the impeccably dressed mannequins and the confident customers walking in, she felt like she didn't belong. Her outfit, though the best she had, looked modest compared to the opulence surrounding her. She pressed her lips together and kept walking, trying to ignore the growing discomfort inside her. Finally, after a few more minutes of hesitation, the jewelry store appeared before her. Its facade gleamed with impeccable elegance. Large windows showcased sparkling pieces on velvet cushions. Grace stopped in front of the jewelry store door. Her heart pounded, and an inner voice whispered that she didn't belong, that it was foolish to even try. She looked at the door and the golden lights inside. Should she go in? What if they humiliated her? Being honest with herself, she couldn't bear another contemptuous glance. But the longing to get that bracelet pushed her forward. She took a deep breath, and without looking back, pushed the door open. The interior was even more dazzling than the display window. Golden lights illuminated showcases filled with delicate jewelry, and the scent of leather and expensive perfume lingered in the air. Grace stepped toward the glass display, but her purse slipped from her shoulder and fell to the floor with a loud thud. The sound shattered the store's soft murmur, and suddenly, every eye seemed to turn toward her. Her face instantly flushed red. She felt her body shrink, wanting to disappear, wishing the ground would swallow her whole. She couldn't stop thinking about what they must be thinking of her. Suddenly, it felt even more obvious that she didn't belong there. From the other side of the store, a salesman observed her for a brief second before looking away. A shiver ran down Grace's spine, as if her entire being was being evaluated at that moment. Was it so obvious that she didn't fit in? She forced herself to walk toward the glass display, trying to ignore the disdainful gaze she could still feel on her. Grace stepped up to the counter with a firm stride, though inside, she felt a knot in her stomach. Her eyes scanned the glass display, where several bracelets gleamed under the store's bright white lights. "Excuse me, I'd like to see that bracelet over there." She pointed to a delicate piece with small diamond inlays. The salesman, a middle-aged man in an impeccable suit, paid her no attention. He turned to another employee, murmuring something in a low voice and offering a slight smile. Grace waited a few seconds, but no one responded to her request. She cleared her throat. "Excuse me, could you show it to me?" she repeated in a firmer tone. The salesman raised an eyebrow and looked her up and down, assessing her with an expression that made it clear what he thought. After a few seconds of silence, he sighed and shook his head indifferently. "That piece is quite exclusive," he finally said, without moving from his spot. "These are high-end jewels." Grace felt her heart pounding. He hadn't told her the price, hadn't even asked if she could afford it. He had simply dismissed her outright. Her hands clenched into fists. "Even so, I want to see it," she insisted, without looking away. The salesman sighed impatiently. "Honestly, these pieces are very expensive," he repeated, in a tone even more condescending than before. "They're not for just anyone." The salesman looked at her again, this time with a sarcastic smile. "You know what? Maybe you should go to a store more suited to your budget. We're not here to sell fantasies." Heat rushed to Grace's face. She wasn't going to leave. Not without that bracelet. Just when Grace thought she couldn't feel worse, an elegantly dressed woman entered the store, noticing her immediately. She stopped in front of her, scanned her with a cold gaze, and, in a loud and scornful voice, remarked, "God, I can't believe they let just anyone in here." Her stifled laughter filled the air, and Grace felt her face heat up with shame. She knew she wasn't dressed like the kind of clientele that frequented the store, but she hadn't expected to be treated this way. She refused to lower her gaze. Taking a deep breath, and with the firmest voice she could muster, she insisted, "I want to see the bracelet, and I have the money to pay for it." The salesman looked at her with skepticism, and a mocking laugh formed on his lips. "These pieces are far too expensive for you," he said, as if the very idea that she could afford such a luxury was absurd. He turned on his heel and walked to the display case where the bracelets were. Grace followed him with her eyes, her heart pounding. The man opened the display case slowly, as if unveiling a sacred object, took out the bracelet, and held it up in front of Grace. But instead of handing it to her, he simply showed it, as if examining whether she deserved the honor of touching it. His gaze swept over her again, full of disdain, and he said in a tone that felt more like a reprimand, "These pieces are far too expensive for you." Grace felt a knot in her stomach. She stared at the bracelet, so close yet so far away. Something inside her screamed not to give up, not to give them the satisfaction of making her doubt herself. But the weight of humiliation was hard to ignore. Grace kept her hand extended for a couple of seconds, waiting for the salesman to hand her the bracelet. However, instead of doing so, he withdrew it with a slow and deliberate gesture. His expression was a mix of skepticism and superiority. "You must first prove that you can afford it," the salesman said, lifting the bracelet in a defiant manner. "We are not used to just anyone walking into this place." The comment echoed through the jewelry store, drawing a few curious glances. A couple of customers nearby made an effort to feign disinterest in the scene, but it was evident that they were paying attention to what was happening. Silence stretched across the store. The gazes of employees and customers intertwined in a suspended moment. Everyone was waiting for a reaction. Grace felt the pressure of every passing second. Grace's shoulders tensed. A part of her wanted to turn around and leave to avoid further humiliation, but something stronger kept her standing her ground. She reached for her purse with determination and began to open it, ready to show her credit card, when a movement at the back of the store distracted her. From one of the leather armchairs in the lounge area, a man who had remained silent until now lifted his gaze. His attire was impeccable, a designer suit without a single wrinkle and perfectly polished shoes. Ethan Montgomery observed the scene for a moment, his eyes fixed on what was happening. A growing frustration tightened his chest. He had seen this before too many times, and for a brief second he almost let someone else step in. But the decision was swift. He took a step forward and walked toward the counter with firm, measured strides. He didn't need to raise his voice to be noticed. His mere presence shifted the tone of the scene. The employees exchanged glances, as if suddenly realizing who he was. Ethan stopped beside Grace and looked the salesman directly in the eyes. His expression was serious, but not aggressive. His tone was firm when he spoke. "Serve her like any other customer." The salesman blinked, surprised. The certainty in Ethan's voice made it clear that this was not a request, but a command. For the first time since Grace had entered the jewelry store, the employee seemed to hesitate. "Mr. Montgomery," he stammered, finally recognizing the designer. "It's just that." "There is no it's just that," Ethan interrupted without changing his expression. "She is here to buy. Treat her with the same respect you would give anyone else." The silence in the store grew even heavier. Grace felt her heart pounding. She didn't know the man who had stepped in for her, but his mere presence seemed to have shifted the entire dynamic of the room. She looked at the salesman, waiting for his reaction. The man swallowed hard and lowered his gaze slightly, still holding the bracelet in his hand. Some of his arrogance had faded, but his attitude had not completely changed. The atmosphere in the jewelry store remained tense. The eyes of the customers and employees moved between Ethan, the salesman, and Grace, anticipating the next move. Something in the air suggested that this was far from over. The salesman crossed his arms and lifted his chin. "I'm sorry, but we can't serve everyone," he finally said in a calculated tone, without taking his eyes off Grace. Grace felt a pang of indignation in her chest. She knew what the man meant, but before she could reply, she sensed Ethan shifting slightly beside her. "Excuse me?" Ethan said. His voice was calm, but his gaze was firm. "Are you telling me that in this store, you choose who deserves to be a customer and who doesn't?" The salesman hesitated. For an instant, he seemed unsure whether to persist in his attitude or back down. Then he chose to hold his ground. "We don't serve just anyone," he said, his voice cold and sharp. "We only serve serious customers. We don't have time to waste with inquiries." The way he said it, with a slight smug smile, made the tension in the room rise. Ethan pulled his phone out of his pocket and began recording discreetly. "Interesting," he commented, holding the device naturally while pointing it at the salesman. "So, if someone walks into this jewelry store dressed a certain way, you won't serve them, right?" The salesman clenched his jaw. He looked around, noticing that some customers were paying attention. The pressure in the room grew when, from the back of the store, a middle-aged woman in an elegant black suit approached. Her stride was firm, her heels echoing on the marble floor. Her name tag gleamed under the store's lights. "Is there a problem?" the woman asked in a measured voice, though her gaze showed slight annoyance. The salesman let out a faint sigh of relief and turned toward her. "This young lady wanted to see a piece, but it seems she's only here to ask questions," he said, emphasizing the last word. The store manager gave Grace a quick once-over before locking eyes with Ethan. Her expression shifted when she noticed the phone in his hands. She stepped forward and offered a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Sir, I would appreciate it if you didn't record inside the store. It's our policy." Ethan raised an eyebrow, not lowering the phone. "Is it also your policy to discriminate against customers?" The manager narrowed her eyes for the briefest moment before turning to Grace. "Excuse me, miss, but if you're not going to make a purchase, we need you to leave room for other customers." The air seemed to grow heavier. Grace felt something churning fiercely inside her. She knew this wasn't fair. She knew she couldn't allow herself to be treated this way. She knew she was about to be thrown out, but something deep inside refused to accept that defeat. She had worked hard for her money. She had every right to be there. She turned to the manager, her eyes burning, and said in a low but firm voice, "I'm not leaving. You are not throwing me out. And that video is going to show the world why." Ethan, by her side, noticed her internal struggle. He observed her hardened expression and, without hesitation, took a step forward. His voice resonated with more firmness than it had until now. "This is unacceptable," he said in a more aggressive tone. "I can't believe that in the 21st century, you are still acting this way. Do you really think you can treat people like this just because of how they dress?" The salesman frowned, crossing his arms. The store manager let out a sigh of exasperation, as if dealing with an annoying problem. "Sir, I ask you to lower your voice," she said coldly. "We don't want any trouble here." "Trouble?" Ethan let out an incredulous laugh. The problem is being caused by you with your absurd discrimination. The only thing this girl wants is to buy a bracelet. Since when do you need a dress code to sell jewelry? The tension in the store increased. Some nearby customers pretended disinterest, but their gazes betrayed their discomfort. The employee swallowed hard, her rigid posture showing that she had not expected such a direct confrontation. She looked at her coworker for support, but the salesman simply shrugged. At that moment, a side door of the jewelry store opened. A tall, burly security guard appeared on the scene. He walked with a confident stride and a stern gaze, observing the situation before speaking. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, addressing the manager. "Yes," she responded immediately. "This young woman and her companion are disrupting the store's atmosphere. They're not going to buy anything, they're just causing a scene." The guard fixed his gaze on Grace, and then on Ethan. His presence commanded respect, and for a moment, all the noise in the store seemed to vanish. Grace felt her pulse race even more. Ethan did not back down. He raised an eyebrow, not looking away from the guard. "We're here because my friend wants to buy a bracelet," he said, his voice still firm. "The only thing we've received is contempt and mistreatment. And now, are you going to kick us out for demanding to be treated with respect?" The guard did not respond immediately. He looked at the manager, seemingly waiting for instructions. The woman crossed her arms and lifted her chin as if she had already made up her mind. "If you don't leave on your own, I will have to escort you out," the guard finally said in a tone that left no room for discussion. Grace felt all the air leave her lungs. Helplessness mixed with anger, but also with a deep sadness. It wasn't fair. It shouldn't be this way. And yet, here she was, facing a situation that seemed impossible to win. Ethan, however, did not seem willing to give up. His jaw tightened, and his gaze hardened even more. "Seriously?" Ethan murmured, his tone sharp, as if he were about to break the silence with a blow. "Then let's make this interesting." As he said this, he raised his phone and began to pan across the store, making sure to include the guard in the frame. "I've been recording everything since this started, and I will keep recording while you try to throw us out." The guard took a step toward him, his face twisted with anger, and reached out his hand, clearly intending to snatch the phone away. But Ethan, quick and sharp, anticipated his movement. "You can't take my phone without risking a theft complaint afterward." The guard stopped dead in his tracks, his hand suspended in the air, and his eyes flashed with a mix of anger and frustration. For a moment, everything froze. Ethan did not look away, his posture defiant, while the guard, after a moment of uncertainty, held back, taking a step back. The tension between them was palpable in the air, and for a moment, no one moved. Ethan, without losing his composure, added, "There are enough witnesses. You could take my phone and erase the evidence of the discriminatory treatment happening here, but you wouldn't escape the theft charge, and that could mean a few months of arrest and the loss of your job." The guard swallowed hard, clearly uncomfortable. The threat in Ethan's voice was clear, and the guard knew it. The store, which had previously been buzzing with murmurs, now fell into absolute silence. No one dared to say a word. Rihanna was in an exclusive boutique, calmly observing a selection of dresses, while her assistant reviewed a to-do list on her tablet. Despite the tranquility of the setting, the singer didn't feel completely comfortable. That morning, she had faced an unpleasant situation at another store, where the treatment she received left a bad taste in her mouth. It wasn't the first time she had experienced something like that, but it didn't make it any less frustrating. She picked up a dress and studied it carefully, but her mind was elsewhere. The voices in the store were soft, almost a background murmur, until a comment spoken in a louder tone caught her attention. "Are you serious? They're kicking her out just because of her clothes. This is ridiculous." The phrase seemed to come from the hallway outside the store, attracting a few fleeting glances from nearby shoppers. A man who had just exited the jewelry store shook his head as he discussed the situation with someone beside him. His tone wasn't scandalous, but one of sincere annoyance, as if he couldn't believe what he had just witnessed. Rihanna blinked and placed the dress back in its spot. Her discomfort from that morning returned suddenly, mixed with a growing irritation. In her experience, these situations weren't isolated, and hearing something like that right after what had happened to her earlier made her react quickly. She turned toward the boutique's door and looked through the glass at the movement in the hallway. Several people seemed interested in what was happening at the jewelry store, some whispering among themselves, others simply watching with curiosity. For a moment, Rihanna remained still. She knew it wasn't her problem, that she could continue with her day and pretend she hadn't heard. But that thought made her stomach turn. She knew what it felt like, and she knew that if she didn't do something, probably no one would. Rihanna shifted her gaze away from the hallway and turned to her assistant, who was still focused on her tablet screen. With slight tension in her voice, she asked, "Do you know what's happening at the jewelry store over there?" Her assistant blinked and looked up, confused. She followed Rihanna's gaze and observed the movement in front of the store. Several people had stopped, some murmuring among themselves, and the energy in the air indicated that something out of the ordinary was happening. "No, I have no idea," the assistant replied, shaking her head. "But it looks like it's catching a lot of attention." Rihanna pursed her lips, pondering for a few seconds. She took a deep breath and walked toward the boutique's exit with determined steps. Her assistant followed her with her eyes, not daring to intervene. Once she stepped into the hallway, she noticed that the crowd wasn't very large, but the reaction of those present made it clear that something outrageous was happening inside the jewelry store. Rihanna quickened her pace. She didn't like the feeling of not knowing, and the comments she had heard earlier kept echoing in her mind. As she approached the entrance, her frown deepened. From where she stood, she could see part of the scene through the display window. She saw the security guard blocking the exit of a young woman with teary eyes. A well-dressed man was arguing with him, visibly outraged. Then she noticed the expression of a store employee, annoyance disguised as discomfort. Rihanna understood immediately. She had seen this before. Her determination ignited. She wouldn't just stand by. Someone recognized her. "Is that Rihanna?" a voice whispered. Several heads turned toward her, but Rihanna paid them no attention. Rihanna didn't hesitate for a second. With a firm step, she crossed the jewelry store's door, radiating a presence that instantly captured everyone's attention. It wasn't just her fame that commanded respect, but the confidence with which she moved, the determination in her gaze. The tension in the air became evident the moment her voice echoed through the store. "What's going on here?" she asked in a firm, no-nonsense tone. The murmurs among the customers ceased. Some employees remained motionless, as if unsure how to react. Behind the counter, a salesman swallowed hard, his face immediately losing color upon recognizing her. His haughty and indifferent attitude crumbled in the blink of an eye. Suddenly, the situation had taken an unexpected turn for him, and it was clear he was trying to regain his composure quickly. Rihanna waited. The silence weighed heavily in the air. 1 second. 2. No one spoke. Finally, the salesman swallowed and stammered. "Welcome, Miss Fenny. forcing a smile that failed to hide his nervousness. "We was just a misunderstanding, nothing serious." "Misunderstanding?" Rihanna interrupted, her tone as sharp as a blade. "Then tell me, why was she about to walk out with her head down while you laughed with your colleagues?" Rihanna was not easy to deceive. Her eyes quickly scanned the scene. A few steps away from her, a young woman with her head bowed and fists clenched was about to leave the store. Her posture spoke for itself. Humiliation, helplessness. Rihanna felt a knot in her stomach. She didn't need to hear the full story to understand the essentials. Beside her, Ethan Montgomery observed the situation with barely contained indignation. His phone was still in his hand, and judging by his posture, he had been recording up until that moment. The security guard, who just minutes ago had seemed so sure of his authority, now instinctively took a step back. It wasn't fear, it was the awareness that he had crossed a dangerous line. He remained silent, eyes downcast, avoiding any eye contact with the singer. Rihanna narrowed her eyes and crossed her arms, waiting for an explanation that never came. The employees exchanged nervous glances. Rihanna didn't look away from them for even a second. It was as if her gaze stripped them bare, exposing their guilt before they could even come up with excuses. Grace blinked several times, as if her mind were trying to process what she was seeing. Rihanna, the actual Rihanna, was standing there in front of her, frowning, her gaze exuding authority. Her lips trembled, and she felt a knot in her throat. Everything she had tried to suppress until now, the humiliation, the helplessness, the bottled-up rage, welled up in her chest. Her eyes began to fill with tears. The atmosphere in the jewelry store had frozen. No employee dared to make a single move. The people watching from outside crowded at the entrance, whispering among themselves, trying to understand what was happening. Grace swallowed with difficulty, her cheeks burning with shame, but also with relief. She felt protected in a way she had never imagined. She wanted to say something, but her voice remained trapped in her throat. Rihanna shifted her gaze to Ethan Montgomery, who still held his phone firmly. The designer, with his impeccable style and serene expression, understood the unspoken question in the singer's eyes. Without saying a word, he extended his hand and showed her the screen. Rihanna narrowed her eyes and began to watch the video. The recording was clear. Rihanna exhaled slowly, but her posture grew more rigid. She lifted her gaze and focused on the salesman who had treated Grace with such contempt. His face was pale, his hands clasped together nervously. He knew what was coming, and he seemed to be bracing himself for the worst. Rihanna slowly lowered her gaze to her own hand, observing the diamond rings on her fingers, and then, with chilling calm, she looked back up at the salesman. "Tell me." Her voice was almost a whisper, but the salesman shuddered. "What would you do if it were me?" The salesman turned even paler. "I want you to serve her as if she were me." The order rang through the air like a sharp blow. It was not a request, nor a suggestion. It was a demand. The salesman swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously between Rihanna and Grace. It was clear that his mind was scrambling for an escape, an excuse, something to justify his attitude from minutes before. But there was nothing. The weight of Rihanna's gaze, and the crowd watching from the entrance, kept him trapped. From the entrance, someone murmured, "Let's see if he dares to refuse now." Another whispered, "If they don't serve her, this will be an even bigger scandal." The murmuring swelled like a wave. The tension in the jewelry store was palpable. No one moved. No one spoke. Everything hung in suspense, waiting for the salesman's reaction. But the clock kept ticking, and the decision had to be made now. This is a misunderstanding," the man stammered, his tone seeking to justify himself without admitting guilt. His fingers trembled slightly as he tried to pull himself together. He glanced sideways at his colleague behind the counter, searching for support, but received only a nervous expression in return. The singer's presence was overwhelming. He knew that any wrong word could make the situation worse. Rihanna arched an eyebrow, letting the silence speak for itself. Then, with a calmness that chilled the air, she said, "It's too late for that." Her voice resonated with firmness. There were no shouts, no insults, only the certainty of someone who was not going to tolerate what had happened. Grace, beside her, felt like the situation was unreal. An hour ago, no one in the store had taken her seriously, and now, the most influential woman in the place was standing up for her. The designer Ethan, who continued recording discreetly, captured every reaction. Some customers murmured among themselves, while others simply watched in complete silence, absorbing what was happening. Without wasting more time, Rihanna turned to Grace and, with a much kinder expression, gently took her hand. "Come, we'll shop together," she said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Then the salesman blurted out one last unfortunate phrase. "But we didn't know who she was." "That's the problem," Rihanna said, and kept walking with Grace. Grace felt a knot in her throat. Her eyes, still red from helplessness, now reflected a mix of disbelief and gratitude. The salesman opened his mouth as if he wanted to stop them, but he found no words. Any attempt to backtrack at that point would be futile. The two walked toward the exit, without haste, but with determination. Rihanna's heels echoed on the marble floor, accompanied by the sound of Grace's boots. The automatic door opened before them, letting the fresh air of the shopping mall surround them. A complete silence remained in the jewelry store. The customers, the employees, even the security guard simply watched, unsure of how to react. It was as if a storm had passed and left them all speechless. Ethan lowered his phone with a barely perceptible smile. He knew that what he had just recorded wouldn't take long to make waves. Ethan Montgomery takes a few steps away from the jewelry store, phone in hand, reviewing the video he just recorded. The scene is clear. The employee's arrogant attitude, Grace's humiliation, Rihanna's intervention. Everything is captured in high definition, without cuts or edits. He knows this footage carries weight, that it's not just an isolated incident. But he hesitates. What if no one pays attention? What if the store manages to twist the story? He looks around. Some people are already glancing at the jewelry store in confusion, murmuring among themselves. Among them, a group of young people has stopped, exchanging curious looks as they try to piece together what's happening. Ethan approaches them calmly. "Would you like to know what's going on in there?" The young people nod, immediately expectant. "You won't hear it from me," Ethan says, a glint of conviction in his eyes. "Even better, see for yourselves what happened." He extends his phone and plays the video. The reactions are immediate and visceral. "No way," one of them murmurs, his face completely transformed by indignation. "This is disgusting." A girl snaps, crossing her arms, her expression shifting from shock to anger. "How could they treat her like that?" Another asks, his voice thick with disbelief. A young man in a cap, eyes fixed on the screen, lets out a shaky whisper. "And that's not on social media yet?" Ethan feels a chill run down his spine. There's his answer. He takes a deep breath and, without hesitating anymore, opens his social media app. Before pressing the upload button, he looks up and sees the young people already commenting among themselves, some pulling out their own phones, as if expecting the story to already be spreading. He smiles to himself. Now he knows this is going to blow up. He taps upload. Just a few minutes pass, and the notifications start pouring in. Comments, shares, reactions. The algorithm recognizes the outrage and begins distributing it rapidly. Influencers, activists, and figures from the entertainment world see it and share it on their own accounts. Meanwhile, inside the shopping mall, the news is already spreading among visitors. Some people glance at their phones, and then at the jewelry store with expressions of disbelief. Others murmur among themselves, commenting on the situation. Inside the jewelry store, the employees are still in shock over what just happened. The manager, a middle-aged man in an impeccable suit, stares at his phone with a deep frown. The video is everywhere. The wave of negative comments is unstoppable. "This is a mistake," says one of the salespeople, nervous. "It can't be happening this fast. What if we delete our accounts before they mention us?" suggests another. The manager looks at them coldly. "It's too late. This is going to bury us." The brand's public relations team springs into action immediately. In less than 2 hours, they release a statement on their social media. "We deeply regret the unfortunate incident that occurred in our store. We are committed to improving our customer service and taking the necessary measures to ensure something like this never happens again." But the strategy doesn't work. The public's response is devastating. No one believes in the sincerity of their words. The comments are filled with criticism. "Now you care because you got caught. It's not a mistake, it's your culture. Say whatever you want, we already know how you treat people." Hours after the incident, Rihanna and Grace walk through the shopping mall, away from the commotion at the jewelry store. The young woman is still in shock over what happened. She can't believe Rihanna stood up for her, much less that her story is now in the mouths of millions of people in such a short time. "I don't understand why you did all this for me," Grace murmurs, looking down. "I'm nobody." Rihanna stops and gently places her hands on Grace's shoulders. "Never say that again. It doesn't matter how much money you have, how you dress, or who you are. No one has the right to make you feel like you're less." Grace swallows hard, absorbing those words. With her natural charisma, Rihanna tries to calm her. "Don't let this define you," she tells her. "This isn't about what they did to you. It's about how you choose to move forward." Curiosity pushes Grace to ask, "Have you ever experienced moments like this?" Rihanna lets out a soft hum, looking up as if searching her memory. For a few seconds, she remains silent, her lips slightly parted, her expression hardening under the weight of the memory. Finally, she lowers her gaze and fixes it on Grace. "Not only have I lived through them," she says, with a mix of resignation and contained fire in her voice. "I still live through them." She pauses, as if hesitating to continue. "Just this morning," she finally continues, "I felt it firsthand." Grace furrows her brow. "What happened?" Rihanna takes a breath, her fingers unconsciously playing with the edge of her jacket. "This morning," she begins, her eyes lost on the floor. "I sat at a table with a group of executives from one of the world's most important fashion brands. I had personally invited them to negotiate a collaboration contract. I had spent months preparing the proposal, had a team with innovative ideas, a solid plan. I thought it would be a normal business conversation." Grace watches her attentively. Rihanna crosses her arms and lets out a dry, humorless laugh. "But from the moment I walked into the room, the air was cold. Not a single smile. Not a gesture of enthusiasm. Just distant looks, as if I were something foreign in their space. And then the blow." She pauses, as if she can still hear that executive's voice in her head. One of them had the nerve to say it so casually. Our clients are looking for a more classic aesthetic. Grace frowns. Classic? Exactly. And it didn't stop there. Rihanna leans forward slightly, as if the memory burns in her skin. Another one added, "We want to stay away from urban trends." The silence between them thickens. Grace feels a knot in her stomach. "That's what they said?" she asks incredulously. Rihanna nods slowly. It was their elegant way of saying they don't want a black woman as the face of their brand. The anger reignites in her eyes, but her tone remains controlled, tempered by pride. I could have confronted them, yelled, demanded explanations, but I didn't give them that pleasure. I stood up, gave them a smile I didn't feel, and walked out of the room without saying another word. Grace watches her in silence. She knows that beneath that apparent calm, there is a storm waiting to break free. "And then you came here," Rihanna nods. "With a broken heart, yes, but not defeated." They walk past another jewelry store, smaller, but just as elegant. Rihanna stops and looks at her with a warm smile. "Let's do this the right way." They walk in together and are greeted with kindness. This time, there are no judgmental glances, no condescending remarks. Grace looks at the display cases with slight hesitation, but Rihanna encourages her. "Pick the one you like." When she finds the perfect bracelet, Rihanna doesn't let her pull out her wallet. "This is my gift to you," she says firmly. Grace tries to protest, but Rihanna shakes her head. "It's not because of what happened. It's because I want you to look at this bracelet and remember that you are worth more than what any store can make you feel. Because you deserve something beautiful with no conditions." The saleswoman carefully wraps the bracelet, and as they leave the store, Grace holds it in her hands, feeling that what happened that day has changed her in ways she doesn't fully understand yet. Grace turns to Rihanna and, with a sincere smile, thanks her, not just for the bracelet or for standing up for her at the jewelry store, but for the lesson she has given her. "I admire you not just for your career, but for the strength of character you've built," Grace confesses. Rihanna returns the smile, a spark of complicity in her eyes, and regrets not having more time at that moment, as her schedule calls for her. However, before saying goodbye, she makes a promise. "Tomorrow, we'll meet again. I want to know your story and hear about your plans." Grace nods, surprised and excited. She never expected that this day would end this way, with the promise of a new meeting and the beginning of what might just become a great friendship. The jewelry store video exploded on social media. In less than a day, it amassed millions of views and sparked a global debate about discrimination in fashion. Public figures and ordinary users shared their opinions nonstop. The issue wasn't new, but this time it had a face, irrefutable proof, and an ally impossible to ignore: Rihanna. While some tried to justify the store's elitism, thousands of people shared their own stories of discrimination in the world of luxury. Grace was no longer just a humiliated customer. She had become a symbol. The jewelry store attempted damage control. They issued a public statement apologizing for what had happened and assuring that their staff would receive training in inclusion. But no one believed them. Every word of their apology was analyzed, ridiculed, and disproven with screenshots of their employees' past behavior. It was too late. Their reputation was in ruins. Grace could barely process it. Her story had touched thousands, and her inbox was flooded with messages of support and similar experiences. She had become the voice of a cause bigger than she had ever imagined. The media whirlwind was overwhelming. In the blink of an eye, her face was everywhere. What began as humiliation had turned into a movement. Days later, Rihanna was invited to a primetime interview. It was impossible to avoid the topic. The host mentioned the jewelry store incident and asked why she had intervened. Rihanna listened carefully to the question, but when she answered, her tone was calm and firm. "I didn't do anything special. I did what anyone should do." The phrase was simple, but it resonated powerfully. She didn't try to glorify herself or present herself as a hero. She simply made it clear that the problem should never have happened in the first place. Her response became a headline within minutes. If this story moved you, subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss more inspiring content. Share this video with friends and family who need to see stories that challenge perspectives and leave an indelible mark. Explore our channel to discover stories that inspire and transform. Until the next video. The host, intrigued, asked one last question. "I'm curious. You've never been seen carrying a planner before. Why now?" Rihanna lowered her gaze to the object resting on her lap. With an almost unconscious gesture, she ran her hand over the cover affectionately before responding. "These planners are made by my friend, Grace Miller.